on during that process. Again, my name is Mary Ann Dickinson. I'm with the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and we're very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on water efficiency and in-stream flows, a project that we did for the Walton Family Foundation in focusing on the Colorado River Basin. And with me are the project team members, and we'll introduce them to you shortly. Just a few housekeeping announcements. We will be recording this webinar, so we have taken the liberty to go ahead and mute everyone's phones who are participating so that ambient noise doesn't disrupt the recording. But we will unmute the phone after the presentation is over during the question and answer period, so that then you're free to either ask a question out loud or to type a question in the question box, which you see on your screen. Jeffrey Hughes, who is the organizer of this webinar here at the Alliance for Water Efficiency, will be receiving your questions and will be tallying them and asking them then at the end of the presentation. We've allotted 10 minutes for discussion and for questions. And if we have more questions than the time allotted for the webinar, we plan to make an answer sheet available for those questions on our website. But I think we probably will be able to finish. I think we've allotted enough time to enable an opportunity to answer the questions that you may have. We will be posting this presentation at the end of the day, posting it on the website where you registered for this webinar on that page. And we will post the recording at some point several days thereafter once we determine that the recording has worked properly. And I think that's probably all the announcements I have for this moment. Again, you can type questions throughout the webinar in the box, and we'd be happy to take your questions. If you want to minimize that panel for you to see the PowerPoint presentation without that blocking it. So I think let's go ahead and start and then move to the next slide. And what I wanted to do is introduce the panelists who will be speaking to you about our project, in addition to myself from the Environmental Law Institute, and Cindy Dybala, also with the Alliance for Water Efficiency, who was the project manager for this project. So to describe to you a little bit about what the project is, it is a joint project of the three organizations. We received funding from the project was to take a look at what opportunities there might be in the Colorado River Basin for dedicating water efficiency and gains, water conservation gains, and dedicating that into in-stream flow for tributaries and main stem the Colorado River Basin areas. So next. Here are the questions that we attempted to answer in the project. Had already been done and what might be applicable. We wanted to look at what the legal issues were in this project. Obviously, Western water law is a significant concern to all of the states in the Colorado River Basin. We wanted to inventory what the practical challenges were of trying to move that water to a receiving stream. And we wanted to inventory in detail, in particular, not just the barriers, but the opportunities and the approaches that we would need to use to make it happen on perhaps a more widespread basis. So next slide. So again, our focus was basically took a look at all the states and their authorities in this big project. So the case studies that we're going to present to you will be summarized by Michael Garrity of American Rivers, who did all of the work on the case studies and the case examples. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael, to go through those examples.
Okay, on the screen, we actually talk about a few more in the report, and I'm going to be going pretty quickly because there's a lot to cover here. And like, there we go. Again, in the Bend, Oregon area, and as you can see from this old irrigation flume, there's a long history of irrigation in this area. Next slide. The Deschutes River Conservancy is the driving force in in-stream flow improvements for the steelhead and bull trout and other fish species, as well as recreation and fishing through both the municipal and agricultural sides. Some of their biggest projects have involved piping leaky ditches so that much less water can be diverted. There's been a couple of examples of that with two of the bigger irrigation districts in the area. As well, there are some programs locally and through the Bonneville Environmental Foundation that have allowed people in and out of Bonneville Environmental Foundation's website toward providing money for leasing, which has complemented the efficiency and something that everybody can basically participate in. And just a word about the DRC, the Deschutes River Conservancy, they also have a really broad representation, and that's one of the reasons they've been successful. It involves the Warm Springs Tribe, local irrigation districts, environmental groups, developers, and even timber companies. Next slide. This is a Big Bend. This project really somewhat along the lines of some of the irrigation canal upgrades in the Deschutes Basin is the Grand Valley project in the Colorado. Although this one is on a larger scale, and instead of piping a canal, this involves lining the canal, putting in new check systems, automating it, and allowing for just a lot more precise deliveries of water to existing farms. You can see a map of the Government Highline Canal here, and then you can see the Orchard Mesa Canal to the south. And the next slide will show in green Colorado, and the way it benefits them is by allowing in your average year over 36,000 acre-feet of water to stay in the river, and this will be complemented and augmented by a similar project that's currently occurring in the adjacent irrigation district to the south, Orchard Mesa, which will provide another 17,000 acre-feet. This has been pretty widely seen as a win-win for local farms, which have more precise application of water and more reliable water supply, and the environment for this 15-mile reach. It's not perfect because the water is not always guaranteed in drought years, but it's generally created some real benefits. Next slide, please. And this next slide is just a picture of the confluence of the Colorado and the Gunnison right in the area. A creek that's on the dry side of the Cascades in eastern Washington. Next slide, please. By late spring in the typical year, which really devastated the local steelhead trout population and made coho salmon go extinct in the creek. And the Washington Environmental Council, which is a Seattle-based environmental organization, threatened to sue the irrigation district in the Manassas Creek Basin over their effects on endangered fish species, but they also made an overture to see if the irrigation district would be interested in negotiating and coming up with a collaborative solution instead of litigation. The irrigation district and the local conservation district took them up on that, and they came up with a collaborative restoration plan that has restored water in the lower creek for much later into the year, giving steelhead a bigger of irrigation efficiency and a reverse water rights auction where the Washington Water Project of Trout Unlimited has purchased water from irrigators that largely is no longer needed because of efficiency. So next slide. And here you can see a center pivot sprinkler system, and you can also see a combination of some diversion improvements with a fish passage structure in the creek itself. We're going to move on to the Cedar River in the Seattle area. The snowpack in these mountains is expected to diminish over time because they're not particularly high, and the snowpack sort of serves as a second reservoir for the supply. So Seattle saw that there was clearly a need to up its conservation efforts to both protect its own supply and meet the needs of Endangered Species Act listed Chinook salmon and steelhead, and try and avoid litigation, which was eventually avoided in the form of a habitat conservation plan and in-stream flow agreement with the local Muckleshoot Indian tribe and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And after really beginning conservation efforts in the 1980s, they really ramped it up in the Seattle area and have reduced water use by 24% since 1990 and reduced per capita water use since the in-stream flow agreement and habitat conservation plan has been in place. They've achieved the in-stream flow requirements necessary to provide adequate head. Next slide, please. An irrigation district and a number of farmers. Here, the Montana Water Project of Trout Unlimited worked with an individual farmer, ranching couple, John and Irene Weaver, and they converted a long leaky ditch to direct pump and moved from wheel. This resulted in drastically reducing the diversion to this ranch by 18.5 cubic feet per second, down from down to 1.5 CFS from originally 20 CFS, which has helped improve in-stream flows, as did the solar stock well or projects like this around the western U.S. that have been done by Trout Unlimited's Western Water Project, Clark Fork Coalition, various state water trusts. The next slide is just a picture of the stock for is another. It's a little bit like the Cedar River example. It's a place where listed salmon and steelhead populations led to the need to change the way that this river is managed and to implement conservation. Here what was needed was conservation to actually allow for lower flows in the summer and reduce the slug of water that was released by an upstream dam, so that fish didn't have such high, fast water when they were trying to, when they were emerging and rearing in the river. And then the other benefit of implementing that conservation to actually reduce summer flows was that then there was more water left to increase flows in the fall for Chinook salmon when they start coming up. Here you had coho, Chinook, and steelhead all impacted by this, and the idea was to basically use conservation to allow for a more natural flow regime. And the conservation flows, they haven't really they haven't met the goals of those entities. Are currently working with the California Department of Water Resources to make that happen, and I think people are optimistic that with more conservation and on both the municipal and agricultural sides of that flows can be restored. And then next slide. So in terms of what the cases tell us on the whole, first, external drivers like the endangered species, successful case studies. Funding is also needed for success and sometimes can actually substitute for an external driver like an external regulatory driver. The Bonneville Power Administration's mitigation funds for their dams in the Pacific Northwest has been one thing that's helped. Local nonprofit funds can help. Other funding sources from hydropower activities is often a good source. Cooperation among parties is really essential in most cases to and magnify and make sure that you get as much out of these projects as you can. Along those lines, water efficiency is often combined with restoration actions like fish passage and habitat restoration to get more bang for your these case studies or of a successful in-stream flow improvement project is site-specific and really depends on how big the creek is, what the politics are in an area, what funding sources are available, and what the reasons you're doing it are. So it's, anything from the North Fork Blackfoot example on that very small scale with an individual farmer to the Grand Valley project, which involved federal agencies and really significant sized irrigation districts. So I will now hand this off to Adam Schempp to discuss the legal aspect.
Michael mentioned I will be talking about how receptive the Colorado River Basin may be legal in broad terms, of course. So generally speaking, typically are all parts of the project allowed in the old one, for example, the threat of forfeiture or the fact that a state allows Instream present in the new one. Basically critical factors that may really affect water management decision-making, statutes, regulations, ordinances, programs, compacts, treaties, etc. Given the scope of the project, we looked at the most widely applicable and influential of those laws, and we had a particular emphasis on state law. But with variation across states, influence of local ordinances, roles of federal contracts, not to mention politics, hydrology, and public opinion, the effect of law on any project trying to connect water conservation with in-stream flow almost inevitably is going to be case-specific. Next slide. There are many federal laws that affect or have the potential to affect this link that we're discussing, facilities, their storage facilities. The federal government also has its own rights to water and the exercise of these. And finally, you also have the U.S. Supreme Court, which has original jurisdiction over those controversies that involve two or more states. This can be demonstrated through the famous 1964 Arizona v. California case. That was a seminal decision in the Colorado River Basin. And more recently, you have the Montana v. Wyoming case decided this year, actually, that may have, could potentially have a lasting impact on how people view water use efficiency. Next slide. 1.5 million acre feet among California, Arizona, and Nevada, them 1.5 million acre feet a year, and then also ensuring that sense of water conservation and stream flow protection. And first looking at it from the perspective of conservation efforts, it's not necessarily direct or evident what kind of impacts the law of the river may have in this regard. The threat of a compact call may encourage water conservation efforts in the upper basin, whether it's for better weathering a call, a compact call, effectively the lower basin requiring that the 7.5 million, or really including Mexico's portion, basically that the lower basin receives their amount of water, which would basically curtail usage in the upper basin, or more or less that, again, with this compact call concept that so this may prompt conservation. It has the potential to prompt conservation. Also, as rights to stored water become more transferable between the years and between parties, banking and flow protections, however, is a little more evident and unfortunately a tad grimmer. By quantifying the rights that each state has, it's more or less created this mentality of keeping the full allocation in state, but really protect in-stream flows as they go from state to state. This is particularly well demonstrated in a handful of states that have express laws limiting where in-stream flow rights can go past beyond the state borders. Next slide. There on the ways in which water conservation can be linked to in-stream flows. The most beneficial use or otherwise exempted from forfeiture, by conserving, you're not actually using the water, and that portion of the conserve of your right that is conserved could revert to the state. This does, or at least has the potential to create a disincentive to water. Arizona has never enforced it. If it's and then Nevada actually on surface flows does not have a forfeiture exemption anymore, or a forfeiture law anymore. But that threat can still linger. California, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah have mechanisms that protect conserved water from forfeiture, even if these protections are limited and thus far largely unused. But overcoming forfeiture concerns can allow right holders to leave in stream that water which they don't need, as are incredibly oversimplistic. There's a lot greater detail in the report itself, and I look forward to questions as we progress. So forfeiture itself can only protect the water right. It does not actually protect the water that is then in the river from being used by others. And in effect, to protect that water requires putting water to another use, and that use being in-stream flow in some form, whether it's recreation, fish, wildlife, etc. And purpose of use of conserved water. New Mexico allows it from agriculture. Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming expressly prohibit it from agriculture. And these other instances, there basically just is not a clear answer in law proper. This basically, the opportunity, next slide, water right cannot be changed to in-stream flow. The answer here is actually uniform, and for all states, all 7 states, it's yes, flow. Because when you're talking about conservation, you're talking about moving water that has been historically used for a purpose and putting it to this new purpose being in-stream flow. We're not talking about the allocation of new water for in-stream flow protection. Next slide. But there are pretty important differences to note among the states. Anyone can hold a converted in-stream flow right in California, Nevada, and potentially New Mexico, but only the state can hold such rights in Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, and thus far, New Mexico. Fish organizations, as well as the state, can hold them in Utah, which a water right may be changed to an in-stream flow purpose. These factors really matter when you're discussing this link of water conservation and in time. Can the changes be permanent if they're held by an individual, or long-term lasting? And how much process and proof is required to put the water to an in-stream flow? This, unfortunately, is, again, oversimplistic, so we don't get into a lot of the detail of exactly what is expected in order to prove that those reasons are real. But that can but I know that was a very quick run-through on the legal side. Again, I look forward to your questions, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy.
Hi, this is Cindy, and you've heard now about 2 of our 4 questions. What's the experience elsewhere in linking water efficiency programs and in-stream flow protection? You've heard about the legal issues associated with the Colorado Basin states. And I will now discuss the practical challenges that we heard about, and then talk about the opportunities in forms of incentives and strategies, factors of success, and approaches to partnership. So as part of the project, we talked to over 60 folks in the basin from a variety of water management perspectives. And we heard a great deal about the range and diversity of challenges that folks contemplate when they think about linking water efficiency and stream flow protection. For some, the biggest concern is impairment of their water rights. For others, it's fear, uncertainty, and trust that dominate, hindered conversation in the past about these topics and hindered action. That physical aspect should not be, doesn't necessarily produce more water, particularly on the ag side, and for sure it doesn't produce it when and where you might need it for stream flow. We talked to. There is a disconnect in costs, the benefits, and the impacts, who bears them up front, and who, but many of these challenges suggest incentives or strategies for dealing with them, or so we heard. Next slide. So how do you forge the link? We heard loud and clear that attitude and trust and willingness to participate, motivation particularly, were mentioned. If you can identify common ground, people seem to feel that you can get somewhere. We heard this as well. While in the case studies, external drivers were in many cases the initial motivation. Folks in the Colorado Basin felt that the external driver is not required to institute or continue a project. Initial motivations can come from many sources besides outside events. We also heard that while money is very, very useful, it is not necessarily the only or primary factor in getting folks to the table. As you heard, the actual law and the perception of it can differ, and that needs to be taken into account. And the timing and the location of the water needed for stream flow matter a great deal in seeing whether in a particular situation there's a practical solution. Next slide, please. what are the conditions to work? A clearly identified stream flow stretch and a need for the water, and the corollary, a water efficiency program that produces water when and where it's needed. These, if you will, provide a geographic perspective on what opportunities are out there. And they also go a long way toward addressing a concern that a number of folks raised about unintended consequences and the need to think through them before you start. Next slide, please. So these other factors, but we heard that willing partners that can address an issue on a watershed basis and cooperate with others is a key to success. A catalyst or champion for the cause is a key to success. Think Montana and the Trout Unlimited project that Michael talked about. A locally tailored approach is key. Each case clearly differs, both in its physical aspects and in the needs and concerns of the partners. And so just as clearly the approach and incentives would vary in each case. Creative funding, and Michael talked about a number of these approaches in the case studies. Creative funding is necessary to start a program. As Adam discussed, a defined legal path up front goes a long way to avoiding potential legal issues down the road. And short-term efforts allow folks to try out the idea. They're more appealing somehow, and they lead to greater success. Next slide, please. So in looking back, challenges and opportunities, we identified several that if they want to explore further the linkage between water efficiency programs and in-stream flow protection. A farmer and a nonprofit work pretty quickly, farmer or rancher. A community with a direct river connection, be that a physical connection, they can see it run through their town, or an economic connection such as recreation interests, has already got the motivation, some progress linking efficiency and stream flows. One application of this is the Conserve to Enhance model that was first pioneered by the University of Arizona. It is now being tested in Tucson, Arizona. In that case, the community is the individual water rate payers. Residents decide if they want to undertake efficiency measures. Residents decide if they want their money to go to the restoration project. But the more general connection applies also. A modernizing agricultural district, and there are many in the West that are in the Colorado Basin that are undertaking these projects, can find a lot of benefit from a small addition for water efficiency methods. And some of the funders of these projects, such as the Bureau of Reclamation, will give extra points for a modernization application if it also has an environmental benefit. Profit Catalyst, with a strong local relationship, and that appears to be the key, can lead the way in exploring a notion of connecting water efficiency and stream flow in a given watershed. Three-way trades, such as those that have been undertaken for water transfers, have potential here. For example, putting together an agricultural water district with a state fish and game agency that manages water with an in-stream need in another, anticipating an environmental need, be it physical or regulatory, can make some headway, although the more people you have, clearly the slower you go. That if you get to the end, that's fine. So this is what we identified for approaches to partnership that would allow local partners to address a physical opportunity that might develop in a watershed within the basin. Next slide, please. So what can states and nonprofits do to set the stage for these locally based actions? Major legal and policy changes are not necessary, although some of them might help. But we're not talking about reform in Western water law here. We're talking about localized actions that are buttressed by state and nonprofit organizations. So another, a very useful thing, however, is for a state to make the connections and publicize them between agency program, letting water users know that the two programs don't need to work in isolation, that funding from one might be able to support the goals of another. They allow folks to look next door and say, oh, okay, that seems like an idea. Upcoming ESA hotspots matter a fair amount. As you heard from Michael, the driver in a lot of the examples we looked at was initially the concern about endangered species and the stream flow issues coming, threatened and endangered species that they're watching, and publicizing the basins, the watersheds in which those species reside, and just giving folks a little heads up that something might be coming down the pike could spark some interest in this approach. And they're already achieving environmental benefit with their conservation programs. And so dialogue with them, either municipal or agricultural, can spark some ideas for making the link. In some cases, the hard work is over. They're already motivated. So these are things that we felt would be, next slide, please. And so to conclude, the way we see making the link between water efficiency programs and stream flow opportunities do in fact exist, but no one gets up in the morning and says, today I'm going to conserve water and it's going to appear below Hoover Dam. It's a little complicated beyond that. We see that tailored incentives for different partners is the key to this. Having willing partners is the most important to build on individual motivations and benefits. Several approaches are possible to partnership, as we outlined, and we think that this has merit in other river basins as well. If you can do it in Colorado River Basin, you can, or anywhere in the West, you've got some potential to do it in other places as well. So thank you for your attention. The report, sections on conservation that we developed in the course of the report, for questions, Marianne and Jeffrey. I hope you've been typing away.
Oh, you know what?
Thank you very much. At this point, it sounds like all of our phones have been unmuted, and I'm hearing background noise, so it does mean that people who are talking either on their phones or to other people in the office should *6 mute their phones so that we don't hear their background conversations. We would appreciate it. So we went ahead and unmuted the line so that if anyone wants to ask questions in person, they can do so. But we also, I assume, Jeffrey, have received some questions that have been typed into you that you could let us know what have come in so far.
Yeah, actually, this is Jeffrey here. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I actually have received no questions, but I do have one hand raised by Richard Siegel, who actually
do you have any questions, Jeffrey?
Sorry about that, everybody. That mute button got me again. My apologies. I did just receive one question, and it's from Richard Siegel, and he wrote, regarding communities with direct river connection, please expand on Tucson model. Does that make sense?
This is Cindy. Sure, I can expand on it a little bit, and I can refer you all to the University of Arizona's Water Resources Research Center website. They have a page specifically devoted to the Conserve to Enhance reports, articles they've written on the concept, and also some information on the Tucson project. So again, the idea in this case is to link the residents of a community with both the water efficiency efforts they take at home and a local restoration or stream flow protection project that money that they save might go to. There are a lot of variations on this. In Tucson, they're to some degree two separate actions. So a resident can undertake the conservation measures, and a resident can choose to donate to the restoration project. The restoration project in that case was developed by a community panel of local residents, and they targeted a particular project with NIFLF. So that's one variation on a theme, if you will. And why I say restoration project is because in some parts of the Colorado Basin, lower Colorado Basin, including parts of Arizona, it's not exactly physical water flow that's the most important part in maintaining stream health. It could be riparian restoration, and that's the case in Tucson.
Are there any follow-up questions to that?
None submitted via the question box.
Is there
I've got a question if you can hear me.
Yes.
This is Norman Johns, and I'm with the National Wildlife Federation office in Austin, working on Texas in-stream flow issues. And we thought about this idea of water conservation as a method for freeing up water, quote unquote. The problem we face in Texas is without that ESA hammer that was common in most of your case studies, if a water provider goes to the expense of conserving water, what we basically see is that's just seen as augmenting or stretching the water supply, and there's really no linkage of conserving water to any other purpose besides that, and that's what I see as one of our major impediments. I'm wondering if you can see, maybe you guys have brainstormed on this, if you didn't have that ESA hammer trying to dictate in-stream flow requirements, is there any way to try to connect the dots there? I'm just having a hard time with that.
This is Adam, and I definitely would love for Michael and Cindy to chime in here as well, but we saw there have been, one of the things that was not mentioned yet, I don't believe, is that we came across over 50 examples when we wound up the case studies that Michael gave, and the ones that are mainly highlighted in the report are really only 6 that we felt like were the most representative of some of the best ideas. But as far as some of those drivers, which I think is what your question is getting at, one other example that we came across, and I'm sure that there are several others and that I'm not thinking of at the moment, but as far as for municipalities with river stretches actually going through the city. And so where streams or rivers were going dry or very low, that there was a significant value to trying to boost those flows and putting forth the effort by the municipality and potentially by others in the immediate vicinity to try to boost those supplies. So it wasn't necessarily ESA driven, but there could be some other factors. Now, the same thing is probably true for recreation benefits, for fishing, if there's a financial incentive there as well. More or less, it tends, I think, usually come back to some form of economic benefit to the public writ large or to particular industries or people if there isn't an ESA hammer to push that forward.
And this is Aaron Citron with Arizona Land and Water Trust down in Tucson, and if I can add to that, up in the Verde River Basin here in Arizona, a lot of the communities along the Verde River have worked, I think, with the Nature Conservancy on putting together an economic analysis of the benefits of the river to those communities to try and tease out some additional drivers besides ESA requirements. So that might be a good example to look at for you in Texas.
Could you repeat that for me?
Yes, there's some, I don't know if anybody else is on the call that might be more of an expert on it, but some folks up in the Verde River Basin from the towns of Clarkdale and Cottonwood and Camp Verde have put together an economic analysis of the benefits to the community of having water in the Verde River that flows right through there. And in doing so are trying to develop some of those additional drivers to take the place of or to add to those that exist with ESA requirements.
Okay.
So I think you can find that online.
This is Cindy. I just actually talked to them this morning. The contact person is Linda Spitzer with the Western Resource Advocates.
Western
Person
Resource
to talk to.
Advocates.
Western Resource Advocates. They're based in Boulder.
Okay.
And if I could just interject real quick here, this is Aaron Lean from the University of Arizona Water Resources Center. And the issue that you brought up is really one of the issues that our Conserve to Enhance program really seeks to address by developing a program that allows you to focus on local concerns. So if there aren't ESA concerns, the funding that you can generate with something like Conserve to Enhance could really focus in on something that is more applicable to your community because it provides some flexibility there. So I'd be happy to catch up with you about that at some point also.
Thanks.
This
is Michael Garrity. I would just add briefly that the other thing that came out of some of our case studies was that sometimes working with an individual farmer who diverted from a key reach of river that in some cases just because of geography might provide a meaningful reach that can be re-watered. You can do that, and sometimes they want to do that just for aesthetic or recreational reasons or saving money for themselves. So when you get down to that smaller scale, I think the regulatory hammer becomes less significant.
is Cindy.
I understand. Oh, okay. We also have a question.
Okay, I just have a couple other quick things to say on this topic. If you go back to the approaches to partnership, we found on the agricultural side a lot more receptivity to this and a lot more action than on the municipal side in the Colorado Basin. Colorado Basin communities, particularly the big cities, facing some of the same growth and shortage issues that you have in Texas. So you might think about it that way, that there may be some potential on the ag side. On the municipal side, there's also a report that Western Resource Advocates did in Colorado looking at West Slope communities and their motivations for doing this. I think it's also on their website, and that's a look at communities who might want to undertake the linkage and what works and doesn't work for them. So you might get some ideas from flipping through that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. So Jeffrey, would you go ahead and read those for us?
Certainly, thanks. The question here is how much wastewater is released into the river, for example, percent of summer flow? How are wastewater flows and water quality managed for in-stream needs?
This is Cindy, and I have a couple of points on that, and Marianne may have more. I skipped over the part about TMDL being a potential motivator, but that was true in a couple of places that didn't make our list of 6 final case studies. But in Montana, for example, the TMDL process, which is essentially a wastewater process, motivated some action to make this connection. And then the other thing that I have to say is in the report, there's a fair amount on the issue of diversions versus return flows in terms of the connection between the two. Marianne?
No, I don't want to add anything to that at this point. Does that satisfy the question? Have we answered your question satisfactorily?
I do have a question relating TMDL. What do you mean by that?
Oh, sorry. Under the Clean Water Act, there's a non-point source process for looking at watersheds, and it's
I can.
Yeah,
total maximum daily loads under the Clean Water Act. This is Adam. Sorry. Total maximum daily loads under the Clean Water Act is part of Section 303D of the Clean Water Act, and it basically requires, as the Clean Water Act is primarily focused on the limitations, technological limitations with regard to wastewater treatment from point sources. TMDLs are really that backstop effort of looking more from a water quality standpoint of are your waters impaired, and if they are, then you have to identify the non-point sources, which are generally anything that's not a point source, but often agriculture and waste or runoff, and versus point sources, which are usually what you might assume sort of pipes coming into the river. Identifying from each of those broadly how much of that pollutant is would be maximally allowed in order to retain your or continue to meet your water quality standards. So it's sort of this back-end check to ensure that you continue to have fishable, swimmable waters, or basically meeting your other expectations for the quality of water for any particular stretch.
Okay, we have a couple minutes left in the time. Are there any other questions? I think Jeffrey might have got one more.
Sorry, yes, thank you. I have one remaining one at this moment, and here it is. It says, examples of agriculture and municipal partnerships were included. How about mining or mineral extraction partnerships?
I can answer that. This is Cindy. We did talk to I talked to some folks in the basin with respect to mining in particular and industry in general, and it didn't make, yes, there is potential in particular cases, but it didn't make the cut for the list because in general, in order to do the water efficiency measure, it requires so much upfront money that the water efficiency going into the stream is the least of the concerns of a potential partner. Now that's an existing plant. Now clearly in a new proposed facility or extraction, you may be talking something different. But that's in a nutshell what happened there.
Okay, do we have any other questions, Jeffrey?
We do not. Thank you.
Do not. Are there any other questions from the audience that anyone would like to, briefly ask? Because we have
kudos to you guys.
Oh. Thanks. It was a great project, and we clearly have additional work that we can do to make this happen on a more regular basis. So we're very interested in your experiences as you go forward and work on these issues in your own communities. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. As I mentioned, we will have the presentation posted online where the reports are also posted, and we're hoping that you've already downloaded them and taken a look. And we'll have the recording of the webinar posted as well once we sort through the logistical issues of that. And I want to thank our presenters, Michael Garrity, Adam Schemp, and Cindy Dybala for their excellent work in presenting the material today. And if you have any further questions, feel free to email us at the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and we'll be happy to answer any continuing questions that you might have on this project. So thank you all again for participating.